Okay. We're going to go to about midnight. Okay, members, take your seats. Take your seats. Delta Stewardship Council is called to order. The chair notices a quorum is present, but to establish that quorum, we'll start with Judge Damrell. Judge Damrell, you just say present, and then we're present. Mr. Johnston, for the quorum. Johnston, present.
Fiorini here.
Eisenberg here. Okay, we have a quorum. All right, Mr. Knopp, remind us where we ended yesterday evening. I think I know, and I brought most of my papers with us. But we have a few items to go on the rulemaking stuff. And my recollection is we were starting on Delta's placed policy 2, page 9 of the matrix. Is that correct?
Page 12.
Page 12 of the matrix. Okay. No, you're right. You're right. Page 12. Okay. So, members, if you would turn to page 12, please, of the matrix, and let's get an update. Mr. Ray, I know not much time has passed, but why don't you tell us where we wound up in general terms on these items, and then we'll go from there.
So we were on,
thank you.
I believe we were at having a general direction on the policy about levy priorities. We got that one done, I guess. RRP2,
yep.
Which was about how we would approach flood proofing.
200-year flood
rural residential development.
Calculation.
Yeah.
Any thoughts overnight from staff on that question?
Well, no,
I
would just say, I think that we've talked about it. I don't know if we want to wait for Councilmember Napoleon to move on.
We got to start
okay.
somewhere.
I would say, I guess, our recommendation remains as proposed. We've talked about preparing a long-term plan for the Delta that looks towards the end of the century. It seems like a long ways away, but if it's our goal, the best available scientific information suggests that the seas may be as high as 55 inches or, even higher in extremely worst-case scenarios by then. It seems like a long way to anticipate until we realize that the flood control systems we depend on today, the Yolo bypass and the Shasta Dam, were planned in the 1920s, which was 90 years ago today. And so it seems worthwhile to look that far ahead as we try to put together.
Mr. Ray, Mr. Fiorini and I were just checking, and your pause about the absence of Mr. Natoli was a correct pause. My apology for telling you to go ahead. I do think we ought to try to do some cleanup stuff, give him an opportunity to get here because he was so interested in those flood things. Mr. Fiorini, you had an issue that you and Mr. Ray were talking about.
Correct. Yesterday, Dan, Greg Zlotnick, towards the end of the day, asked if striped bass are included in the list of invasive species vis-a-vis the Fish and Game Code that we cite in ERP5. Staff was going to do some research and get back to us.
Yeah. No, they're not on the list that is compiled by the Department of Fish and Game pursuant to that definition. If you wanted to address them, I think the appropriate way to do that would be, rather than trying to create a different definition, it would be to revise ERP5, maybe with a new title that it said, avoid introduction of and habitat improvements for non-native invasive species and predatory fish, and then under the regulation A, it would say the potential for new introductions of or improved habitat conditions for non-native invasive species or bass or striped bass must be fully considered and avoided or mitigated in a way that's appropriate to protect the environment or the ecosystem, whatever.
Mr. Chairman, I would support that change. Would you like to have a motion?
Let me just make a suggestion. I tend to support it too, but my suggestion is going to be we see if there's a sampling of opinion from council members and let the staff get more than just an overnight calculation about how to write it. Because you may decide there's a slightly different way to write it, and they'll be coming back to us with all kinds of changes. I do agree the change should be made roughly the way you described it.
So I suppose by common consent, we could
Right.
direct staff to include that in the updates.
Okay, I noticed Ms. Gray just arrived. Ms. Gray, we're trying to give Supervisor Natoli some time to get here before we deal with some of the risk reduction stuff.
Okay.
Mr. Fiorini went back and was talking about the question Mr. Zlotnick had raised on the position of striped bass as part of this whole thing. Mr. Ray's got a possible solution that Mr. Fiorini thinks might be acceptable. Rather than reopen and revote on something we don't have in front of us, we're just asking whether folks in general support the notion of making the change that staff and Mr. Fiorini are suggesting. Then they'll come back with a precise language in May, right?
Yes, what we would do is we'd either use this language or something that would be a slight refinement of this in the rules that we recirculate prior to the May meeting, so they'll go out for a 15-day
Let's ask Mr.
comment
Stevens.
period.
That's exactly right. So we need direction from you as to what to put out in the modified regulations. So if you agree to this concept, we can go back as staff and make the appropriate change.
Well,
but that would go out with the other modifications for 15-day comment,
all right,
and then we bring it back.
Mr. Fiorini's right. Let's suggest an amendment to the previous action we took on ERP 5, right? Is it 5?
Yes, ERP 5. I would move that we add reference to striped bass and predator fish in ERP 5 as staff deems appropriate.
Okay, questions of members? Questions of members? Anyone in the audience like to speak on this issue? Okay, is there pleasure? Move Mr. Johnston, second Mr. Fiorini. Discussion, starting with Mr. Johnston.
Gray, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye. 4 affirmative, 1 abstention, and we'll give Supervisor Natoli a chance to add on to that after he arrives.
I think we'll probably have good attendance for the May meeting.
Okay. Mr. Ray, how about jumping past these risk reduction things and seeing whether we can start the discussion on the definitional sections that you put in there? I know Supervisor Natoli probably has some questions, but we've got to keep going on this. Is that acceptable to you?
Certainly. Yeah.
Okay, then page 14, members. Page 14, this is the definitional language for rulemaking. And remind us again, you and Mr. Stevens, definitional stuff was sort of in policies and regulations, but we've kind of consolidated now. Explain again why, please.
Well,
okay.
The definitions were primarily in the glossary of the Delta Plan at the end of the Delta Plan, as we've compiled them here, too. It's really one of the places in which the rulemakings focus on clarity is, most comes into play. And most of these definitions were brought forward from the Delta Plan. Others, as we wrote the rules, we realized that additional clarity could be provided with sharper definitions. And so we proposed some. We've gotten a variety of comments, primarily about the importance of making them clearer, but in 2 ways. One would be by not inadvertently including within the definitions actually policy language that was a direction one way or the other. And so we've tried to go through and revise that. And then there's been a request that we look carefully when we're using definitions that also might indicate some overlap in regulatory authority with other agencies. So we've tried to do that as well, look at those issues. Chris, am I missing anything else?
No, I think that's generally correct, and these are typical. Chair Eisenberg, you're most familiar with the statutory arena, the legislature. Typical that you have a general definitional section. Right. Same with the regulatory arena. They're a chance to define terms that are used in the statute or the regulations. So it's normal course to have these kinds of things. You and others had asked why there were more regulations than there were policies in the Delta Plan, and this is one of the reasons. in what we're going to propose, just generally speaking, is even more of a consolidation of the definitions that we have in here already, to put them all in one definitional section. Similarly, we've got 3 provisions at the end of the regulatory package that deal primarily with how the regulation should be interpreted and or applied.
This is where we're incorporating statutory or constitutional provisions
That's
under
right,
the general nomenclature that nobody believes they'll apply unless we say they do?
No. I think that they're important, and
I agree they're important.
And for the most part, they're previewed in the Delta Reform Act. So what we've done is we've brought them into the regulations. We're going to consolidate those into one provision as well. But again, this is typical in statutory schemes or regulatory schemes to have a general definitional section as well as a section of miscellaneous or general provisions that deal with the intent and or application of the regulations. So,
is this where that gives me my opportunity to suggest we add in the canon of construction for every wrong there's a remedy? Is that? No.
Sure,
okay.
sure.
All right. Okay. All right. So that's a general introduction. Mr. Ray, again, starting on page 14, do you want to start walking through some of the suggestions and changes?
Well, I would say, again, the changes proposed on page 14 and 15 are merely attempts to respond to comments by making technical revisions to these terms in ways that we think improves their clarity.
I know that, but let's walk through them. I think probably the first bullet point on page 14 is pretty clear. In the definition of ag water supplier, you're also incorporating a Bureau of Reclamation reference as well. Mm-hmm. And you consider that a technical change. Okay. And in base flood?
Yeah, base flood is a term that is used in the policies about flood-proofing rural residential subdivisions, just to make clear what we're referring to there, as with base flood elevation. On the next page, both terms that we've derived from common engineering manuals and probably the FEMA rules. Best available science, I think there were folks who felt that definition was both too long and too short. We've got a fuller, we have a fuller
agreement
explanation.
It was too long and too short?
We have an explanation of best available science that in Appendix A of the Delta Plan that is thorough and provides quite a bit of insight into what our expectations are. I think some folks felt that was better, and others objected to the bulleted approach we used in the draft regulations, and so we're suggesting that this be shortened with a reference to Appendix 1A, which would be pulled from the Delta Plan.
Okay. In the Appendix 1A is the one that's been in
the Delta Plan for a long time, yeah.
Certainly since the fifth, I believe, certainly since the fifth version. Although we've changed, some of the language has changed, no doubt.
Yeah, it's derived advice from the Science Board is my recollection.
Okay, all right. And
similarly with the definition of the co-equal goals, this definition has been proposed because one of the grounds for being a covered action is you have a significant effect on achieving the co-equal goals. And people have asked, what does that mean? And so we've developed these definitions that were in the Delta Plan. And we continue to propose bringing them forward, except in the case of achieving the co-equal goals in a manner that protects and enhances the unique culture, blah, blah, blah. The Delta is an evolving place, and we had a short definition that was derived from the recommendations of the Delta Division Task Force, and had embellished that with the strategies that are part of Chapter 5 of the Delta Plan. Folks thought that was unnecessary, and we agree, and we suggest deleting those materials.
Dan, you're on number 3 on page 16 now?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Ray, do you know where the proposed deleted language on page 16 would appear in the Delta Plan?
Well, those are the principal headings of the policies and recommendations sections of the Delta Plan. Those are the strategies that are embodied that embody those policies and recommendations.
Okay. All right. Go over to page 17.
Yeah, on page 17, the redefinition of covered action is primarily to address a question that was raised about the authority of the council to use a term called an administrative exemption. And we had always envisioned that there would be certain projects that didn't have a significant effect on the co-equal goals, and we wanted to make clear what set of actions we thought those were, and so that the folks wouldn't feel like they had to be filing certificates of consistency on projects that were minor and didn't significantly affect them. And we had erroneously used the term administrative exemptions, where there are people who question that, and so we're proposing deleting these items here, but then we've reinserted them under the definition of significant effect. So we'll get to that later. And that's the fundamental thing we're doing, is still saying these are actions that we think don't significantly affect the co-equal goals. And so they wouldn't be covered actions. We're just trying to reposition them in the definition section so our authority.
And Ms. Ray, am I correct that the bullet on page 17 commenting on the staff explanation should actually be corrected, so you're moving it to subsection what is proposed to be FF?
You're right, sir.
Okay, and I remember, just for your own notes, trying to keep track of this, the subsection is FF, and I think that's on page 19, I believe. Yeah, page 19. Okay. And then, Mr. Ray, if you'd walk over, please, to page 18. And
yeah, the definitions they added on 18 regarding floodways and flood proofing are again, just provide detail that people wanted to see about how they would interpret those provisions. And one of the advantages of using, for example, this term designated floodway in reference to the Central Valley Flood Protection Board's regulations and jurisdiction, then it makes clear that if you're in a floodway that they have designated, you can deal with them from your regulatory compliance, and you wouldn't be a covered action under our situation.
Okay.
Similarly, people had asked at the bottom of page 18 under item
local plans of flood
DB, what local plans of flood control are we talking about? Is it just a ditch my uncle put in on his farm, or does it apply to the county drainage system? Right. And what we were referring to are local plans of flood protection that are submitted to that are prepared pursuant to the Central Valley Flood Protection Board's plan pursuant to the Water Code. And there's a provision for local governments to do those, and so it would make it clear what plans we're talking about.
Okay. All right, page 19.
On page 19, we've proposed a definition for non-native invasive species, a reference to a term used in the Fish and Wildlife Code. And similarly, we've got terms for project and non-project levies, which we use often, and we're defining proposed action, which was a term that some folks had some confusion about. The definition of regulated streams, again, refers back to the jurisdiction of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, and so it allows us, again, to make that trade-off in jurisdiction clear. And then we get to the definition of significant impact, which I think we'll want to spend a little bit of time discussing.
You want to do that after public testimony, or you want to do it now?
I think we'll go through it now, I think. This is, again, so what we're defining, two things. We're defining what has a significant impact for purpose of determining whether a project meets the definition of covered action. And many of the commenters confused the way the significant impact is used in these regulations and used in the Delta Reform Act with the way it's used in CEQA. In CEQA, it requires that the impact be adverse. But the term we're defining here is in relation to whether you have an impact on achievement or one or both of the co-equal goals. And in that case, it could be positive or negative. And habitat restoration project, for example, could have a significant impact on achievement of the co-equal goals because it makes the ecosystem healthier. And that would be a good thing, and we'd want to know about that. A project sponsor would certify its consistency with the plan, and that would provide for the coordination process that the Delta Plan calls for. Similarly, a water supply improvement project that made water supplies more reliable would do the same sorts of thing, and we would be aware of it and could, carry out the consistency function that the certification process calls for. So we don't want the term significant impact to only be defined in a negative way. And then we get to the following categories on page 20, where we would suggest the council conclude that certain kinds of activities, by definition, don't have a significant impact. And again, these are the ones that we moved from the section we had previously described as categorical exemptions. So they would include, ministerial projects or emergency projects. And then we have one that I think will be the subject of some controversy, and it's been the subject of a lot of discussion before the council, and that is the treatment of temporary water transfers of up to a year's duration. This is, you've talked about this a lot. The origin of this is that the Environmental Quality Act provides, if I remember correctly, an exemption from SEQA compliance for temporary water transfers of up to a year under certain conditions. And the council's been concerned that we don't have enough information about these sorts of transfers, in part because some of them are unregulated, to understand whether or not they do have a significant impact on achievement of the co-equal goals. And so we've been reluctant to recommend that you provide an exemption for them. Where the council ended up after quite a bit of discussion when the Delta plan was finalized last fall was that you would maintain this exemption, but you would only do it through 2014, and that the exemption would be repealed in 2015 unless you had extended it. And we talked about working with a stakeholder group that's the Delta plan recommends be convened to review this matter, and as part of their looking at the ways they could improve and streamline the general processes for water transfers, and with the thought being that if we got information back out of that stakeholder group that confirmed temporary water transfers of up to a year in duration didn't have a significant effect, then we could revise the rule and extend it. Our recommendation to you, and it's we garbled it in the staff report, where actually our recommendation is that the one that's under 3A, and that would be that you extend the deadline for an additional year. Given our delays in getting the Delta plan adopted, we think it would be reasonable to provide that stakeholder group additional time to work through this issue and pull together the information that would allow you to confidently confirm that these one-year transfers don't have a significant impact. The third choice would be that just to determine that temporary water transfers of up to a year in duration don't have an impact, don't have a sunset clause, and just exempt them completely. And that would conclude the basic recommendations that are in the definition sections.
Okay, let's go and get questions. Members, let me just make a suggestion, because I'm going to ask the witnesses, the public comments, to do the same thing. If you could start with the earlier sections of the definitional stuff, ask your questions as you just go through the definitional things. We'll talk about them, and then all of us can follow it. So, anyone had, Mr. Fiorini, I know you had some comments on some of them. No? Okay.
The only comment I have is on the one-year transfers, and Dan's right, we're going to be taking that up as a regulation.
That's right. But let's take from the earlier stuff on, as we go through this stuff. Who's got an early comment or question? Ms. Gray?
And just to comment, I think staff has done a great job with trying to clarify different definitions in the plan, and I think that's a good thing to do, and I know you've worked very hard to do that. I want to thank Chris and Dan for coming out to really kind of give me a briefing on everything, and for including in the one-year transfer the language that encouraged the stakeholder group to look at it before the exemption runs out. So I want to thank you for that, because I know you did include that language in here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, Okay, then, Mr. Fear, I'm sorry, Don, Mr.
I
Natoli.
just had one question. It occurred to me
Which
that,
section are you talking about here?
Let me get to. I will get to that. It relates to significant impact, but and how that's measured. So I guess if we go back to page 19 on definition. My question is, and so much with the language, that when we look at measuring the significant impact, you measure it against the co-equal goals, but then with the important qualifier as it relates to the deltas, various attributes and values, is the impact measured against that third? It's not the co-equal goal, but it's also a very, very important qualifier. So when you are looking at impacts, you're certainly looking at water supply reliability and ecosystem restoration, but it also has to take into account the values of the delta. And so I guess it just occurred to me as I was reading this last evening that is it measured in any way against that? I mean, whether it's preserving agriculture, recreation. I mean, there's again, I didn't go back to the Reform Act, but there's certainly quite a bit of discussion in there about that. And so when we're looking at impacts, it seemed to me that might be a consideration that ought to be a part of it as well. It may not rise to the same level. I could certainly argue that it should, but I understand what the legislature did. Because we talk about flood protection and water transfer and so forth, but it doesn't really get to that.
Yeah. The statute defines two co-equal goals, and they're to be carried out in a way that's achieved in a manner that protects and enhances the delta as an evolving place. But the grounds for appeal are really the effects on attainment of the co-equal goals.
But if it wasn't done in a manner that was consistent with preserving and protecting the delta, that wouldn't be significant enough to rise to.
I think let me refer to our learned counsel here.
I think Dan characterizes it correctly, but the nuance that you're talking about is built into the achievement of the co-equal goals by the statute as well. But first and foremost, significant impact is on one or both of the co-equal goals or government-sponsored flood control program.
But since this is a covered action, is it not also correct to say that the objectives in statute that are declared by the legislature as inherent in the co-equal goals includes, as Don mentioned, this the language protect and enhance unique cultural, recreational, and agricultural values of the California Delta as an evolving place. I mean, that's an inherent objective of the co-equal goals. An element, I'm sorry. Is that a right way to describe it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you would, if you were, just to clarify for me, if you were wanted to assert that a project did have a significant effect on achievement of the co-equal goals because it affected the because it affected the delta as a place, you would be arguing that about those effects within the context of the co-equal goals.
So if it damaged or deterred from the delta, not just as a place, but some of those values that are mentioned, it could go forward as long as it met the co-equal goals. The third piece is not an action that would be appealable, even though it's inherent in there. That's what I'm trying to get to, is if we say it's significant impact for covered action, if it doesn't meet one or two co-equal goals. But if it met those two, but still did, damage to the delta, so to speak, that's okay.
Well, again, this isn't meeting the co-equal goals. This is trying to figure out, as the chair said, whether or not a proposed action is a covered action. Mm-hmm. So the determination is whether or not you're having a big impact, a substantial impact, in the first instance on one or both of the co-equal goals, water supply, eco, or flood.
Okay.
So that's to determine whether or not you've got a significant impact. That's one of the criteria for figuring out if you have a covered action. Then also, as we know, one of the policies in the plan, now in the regulations, has to apply to your action before it's even a covered action. And then you have to file your certification. So this is one of the criteria to figure out if a proposed action actually is a covered action. Is it big? Is it impacting eco, flood, water supply. And what we've done here is what we've tried to do in the definitional sections under co-equal goals and achieving the co-equal goals is give stakeholders in the regulated community some guidance as to how we see what the big steps are to get to achievement of the co-equal goals. What does achievement of the co-equal goals look like? How are we going to get there? So if you have a proposed action, you know that you have to, in order to be a covered action, you have to have a significant impact. It's got to be a big project. But the question is always, what does it mean to achieve the co-equal goals? We know the definitional, in statute, but it's very broad. So what we've tried to do is put some meat on the bones to guide people as to whether or not they actually are having significant impact. But again, it's tied in the first instance to an impact on one or both of the co-equal goals or flood. So,
Chris, but then if you take the second instance that it may be tied to co-equal goals or meets those thresholds, but then the second instance is that it does significant harm to some of the values in the Delta, whether they be agricultural, historical, cultural. So
is your question if there's just an impact on Delta as a place, but there is not a significant impact on eco, water, or flood?
That is my question.
Would it still be a covered action? And I think the answer is no. But having said that, I think that they are so inherently tied together through the statute, through 85021, as the chair points out, that in most cases, they are going to have the same sorts of impacts. So you're not going to have just an impact on Delta as a place and no impact on eco, water, or flood, or vice versa.
Mr. Fiorini.
When you guys are discussing issues like this and dealing in generalities and hypotheticals, it's interesting, but it would be more helpful if there's a specific issue, as an example, that we could evaluate. It would be more meaningful, I think. So I can't think of something that would impact the Delta as a place that wouldn't have some negative or positive impact on water supply reliability or the ecosystem. But there probably is. I just can't think of it.
I didn't have anything necessarily in mind. It's just that as I look at significant impact and weigh that out, and then we have the qualifier to the co-equal goals, that if you could meet the threshold of 2 co-equal goals or flood protection, and yet still have the impact. Now, I didn't have anything in mind, so again, it is hypothetical, but I was curious.
Let me give you a flood protection example. It is entirely possible you could find somewhere some flood protection action that both protects lives and property in the Delta and provides habitat protection and protects a portion of the existing water export system, but might impact the kinds of agricultural practices on the islands that achieve the high. So there, I guess, the question, Don, is your question, is it prohibited that there be an impact? Is that what you're asking?
No, that it would, because the covered actions are appealable. If it's not a covered action, then it just goes forward, and it's not appealable, so this council would never...
Right.
This council, it wouldn't see it, so to speak. So you wouldn't have the opportunity to vet those impacts as it relates to your example, Phil, of what that meant to that community for, say, the loss of agricultural land, or if you're wiping out a whole slew of marinas that were recreational
But
land.
in that hypothetical, you would have a significant impact likely on flood control.
Yeah.
So you would see the action as a covered action.
On flood control. What Phil's example was is that
an activity that had impacts on multiple purposes.
Well, then it would be
objective.
a covered action.
Yes.
So you would see it.
It would be.
So
Because the impact can be either positive or negative. So if the example you gave, Mr. Chairman, the impact was beneficial. You were improving flood protection in a way that enhanced the reliability of water conveyance. And so you've got 2 significant impacts on on one of the co-equal goals and on flood control projects. So in that situation, it would be covered, and then there would be potential for appeal. I think the way I've looked at this is we've been mindful of these definitions and the co-equal goals as we've gone through and identified what kinds of actions we thought didn't need to be covered in individual policies. And so I would say, in my own case, I think, for example, that's a reason we're comfortable that agricultural projects that are outside the cities and spheres of influence don't, we can say in those sections about where should development be located. These projects aren't covered by this policy, so we don't need to review them because we see those actions as not having a significant impact on achievement of these goals. And I think as we've gone through in each of the sections, we've thought about that to decide what we could exclude from the regulatory scheme.
So whether it's beneficial or detrimental, it's appealable if there are project impacts.
But again, it's not just beneficial or detrimental. It has to be a big benefit.
Substantial.
Or a substantial one. So again,
And who makes that call?
well, the call is made by the filing
applicant.
agency. But, we've always had this notion that being a covered action is a bad thing necessarily. But this body was put in place to take a big picture view of all the projects out there in or around the Delta that are having significant impacts and knitting those together and making sure they fit together. So if they are a covered action, hopefully they are consistent. Hopefully they've worked through the issues, if they have any issues, before they've filed a certification of consistency, given what you said, that they are appealable. And, we hear complaints still that you're going to hold up and you're, overburdening an already taxed system of compliance. But the whole idea is that this council should be able to see all of the big projects, flood, eco, water, Delta as a play, all achieved in a way that preserves Delta as a place. So, again, we've got this idea that somehow covered action is a bad thing. And
So, Don's question, is it possible that there'd be a project, let's say a habitat project, that in the eyes of the proponents is not significant, but in the eyes of neighboring farmer has a significant negative effect on one of the stated goals, which is the Delta's agriculture environment. So is it appealable by the neighbor farmer who views the impact as significant and negative, even though the project may not be significant, even significantly positive?
The reference to the categorical exclusions, I think, would be helpful in thinking that issue through, because the Secretary for Resources CEQA guidelines determine that they have one of the exclusions that would be incorporated would be unless there's some unusual circumstance, would be the exclusion for small-scale habitat restoration projects, which I believe the guidelines determine are defined as less than 5 acres in size.
But back to...
But assuming that it was a big project, a big eco project, and the state or local agency decided not to file a certification of consistency, again, the way that the statute's set up and that our regulations are set up, that decision is not appealable to the council. So in our regulations, we're clear that the decision, the discretionary decision, has to be made in good faith. It's subject to judicial review, so that issue would be before a court as to whether or not it meets the definition of a covered action. The court's going to turn to the statutory definition, and then they're going to turn to our regulations. And our regulations, first and foremost, talk about, with regard to significant impact, a significant impact on one or both of the co-equal goals or flood control. So we're sort of back to the discussion where we started. That's the initial threshold question.
Well, I thought Don was hinting at how does an aggrieved party achieve standing?
Yeah, and an aggrieved party to achieve standing is going to have to prove, assuming that they were before a court, that the proposed action actually was a covered action, and the reasons were because it met the definition of a significant impact. And so you would first have to show that it has a substantial impact on one or both of the co-equal goals or flood control.
Not necessarily that it diminished
You would,
some of the values.
I don't want to, I mean, my opinion, obviously, with regard to how somebody might file a lawsuit doesn't hold weight, but if it was me, I wouldn't first and foremost focus on the fact that it has a detrimental effect on Delta as a place.
Well, you'd have to start off and say, this is a great project that has a significant impact to improve the habitat of the Delta, one of the co-equal goals.
I might even say one or both.
Once you convince the judge of that, you say, but it's a really bad idea.
Right.
Judge Damrell.
Significant impact is a substantial impact. How do you define substantial?
Well, it's always been interesting to me that you would think this term has been argued about so long. It would be defined by, I've checked it, I looked at my secret manual the other day, and it's really been something that's been done in context. Folks have recognized that things that seem insignificant in some situations can be significant in others. The example I always think of is when Robert Moses eliminated the last freshwater pond in New York City. Wouldn't be such a big deal if he did that in Minnesota land at 10,000 lakes, but when he took out the last one on Manhattan, that had a significant impact. And so I think what the courts have done is look at the term to mean substantial and have judged it in its own context. Am I wrong?
No.
I'm not so sure the court can put it that way. It would just seem to me that you didn't want to expand the definition of substantial impact by deter in such fashion. A little closer to the microphone, please.
Yeah, Judge, could you get closer to the mic because we're...
It just strikes me that maybe you want to. This would be a tussle for a court. I mean, this is truly abstract, substantial, and significant. I'm just suggesting that perhaps you may want to couch the definition in some fashion that would expand on the word substantial. I'm not sure I would use substantial. That would deter in certain ways, and maybe expand on that, so you give a court a real signal as what is substantial, because I think there's redundancy here between significant and substantial. I'm not sure there's any difference between the two.
Yeah, I was looking again at the statutory language from which you've taken it under the covered action definition, sub 4. It says will have a significant impact on achievement of one or more of the goals, and then the flood control programs. And so I guess this Judge Damrell's suggestion is, need you use substantial when you could just simply say significant? Because the change here that you made that makes the statute more clear, as you said, whether it's significant or substantial, positive or negative. That was absent from the statute, and is an open question. And we've resolved that question, it seems to me.
Yeah, that's a keen insight, and I appreciate your comment, Judge Damrell, too. We struggled with this from the get-go, and I think that what we've done is, since our statute, in some instances, but not all instances, looks to the CEQA body of law, as Dan Ray pointed out, and borrows some concepts that, since there actually is case law in that context with regard to using the word substantial to define the word significant, that was as clear as we were going to get at the time. Now, as you point out, Chair, we have added the notion of positive or negative, which does give some clarity, some meat on the bones. My own personal view is that the use of the word substantial doesn't lessen the clarity, given the fact that we do have a body of law that people can look to right now. So I especially appreciate your insight, since you're very familiar with having to decide these ambiguous terms. But I think in this context that we can take another look at it.
Let's get an input from the Attorney General's office. Ms. Vosberg, what's your take on this?
I actually agree with Chris. The CEQA body of law does define significant effect on the environment by using the term substantial. And so that's where this relationship came up in the regulation. So I think it's clear enough to go to pass muster. And I'm not sure that substantial is different than significant.
But there's a body of law that this is a term of art, is what you're saying. And it's been defined by courts what substantial impact is under CEQA.
Right.
Well, that makes a difference then. If that is a term of art, then, I would think that's a persuasive argument in response.
And similarly,
if it is a term of art, then that's a different issue.
Yeah, no. I think that it is. And
are you withdrawing your comment about the need for clarity and simplicity?
I'm not doing anything.
Preparing us for May, I think, maybe.
Well, let's. Don, you wanted to weigh on that?
Just back to kind of my original question. If I go to page 16, in number 3 there, where we're now removing some of the, I guess, core strategies that were in there. Into my earlier question on 3, the last portion of that sentence, where it says, including change associated with achieving the co-equal goals will not cease, but that the fundamental characteristics and values that contribute to the Delta's special qualities and distinguish it from other places can be preserved and enhanced, and this is kind of the key, while accommodating these changes. And so it sets that parameter, back to what I was talking about earlier, that somehow you're going to be able to accomplish co-equal goals and flood protection and do this, but if accommodate means you got to just got to get out of the way and let them do it, because the co-equal goals are higher in the hierarchy of not only the law but what we're going to have as a priority. I don't know that that's what this says, but I guess that's the concern I express. Certainly, when you look at the role of the Delta Protection Commission and what's trying to be achieved, and certainly stated in the previous text here, even on this page. That's kind of wide open. You can go and drive while accommodating these changes. So, we're going to do this, but we say we're going to preserve and protect this special place and enhance it, but we're going to accommodate. And accommodation can be a whole lot of different things. And I don't want to take this too far, but that. Back to my earlier question, is kind of about the legal precedent or covered actions and being an appeal, but that leaves it pretty wide open. And I think what it does is that it layers it in such a way, and maybe that's what the law was intended to do, but this is going to build it into the structure of the Delta plan, is that these 3 things trump the Delta as a place. And if I'm wrong in that characterization, just tell me something.
I don't think that the plan necessarily does that, and we can try to include many provisions in the Delta's place that requires folks who are carrying out projects for water supply purposes, for ecosystem restoration purposes, to respect local land use, to mitigate effects with existing uses or those that are planned, to consult with local governments, and of course all the other recommendations to strengthen it. I was trying to think of an example that a project that would have a significant impact on the values of the Delta as a place, but that would have absolutely no effect on the other 3 requirements, either on water supply reliability or on ecosystem or on flood control. And I suppose that you could imagine a situation where a state or a local agency took an action that eliminated visitor serving recreation use. I don't know why they would do that, but let's imagine that they did one. And it could have a significant impact on the Delta as a place. A favorite landmark could go out of business. Recreation opportunities could be diminished, but it could have absolutely no effect on either the ecosystem or water supply reliability. And I think that would not be covered as a proposed action, and it wouldn't be reviewable by the council. But I was trying to think even the example of like a state lands commission lease, perhaps, that, had no effect on the ecosystem, had no effect on water supply reliability, didn't interfere with conveyance of flood flows, had no effect on flood flows. That might be an example of that.
What if you had a levee under a category of maintenance, where you were doing, we had this discussion yesterday with Melinda about maintenance and improvement, but we've got a series of marinas that are along the existing levee. It's a substandard situation, but you could make the argument that we're doing it under level of maintenance, maybe raising it, but in so doing, the water side and land side uses are going to be affected negatively. They're actually going to go away. Not that there would be other elements to that. But we're going to, as part of that, we'll put a bench down there that helps the ecosystem on the riverside. It may improve conveyance because it helps the channel, but it doesn't affect and obviously would improve flood protection. But you're going to lose three small marinas as a part of that, and whether it was state lands or whatever. Could you that project run the gauntlet and avoid being a significant impact and not be considerate of what would happen if you lost 300 berths for boats and all the other things that serve the visitors?
I think it would depend on how substantial the effects were on water supply reliability. You said it improved conveyance, so I guess how substantial is that?
Yeah.
You said you talked about it improving habitat, and so I guess the question is how substantial is that improvement? And then it's improved the flood control system too, because it's taken a levee that was unstable and it's made it north stable. So I guess, again, it's a question of, how substantial is that effect, and that would be the argument. And then you might think, too, at which stage the certification is being filed as well. So I think that would be the other question. I always, when people ask me this question, I go, well, Major League Baseball describes the strike zone, but every umpire calls it their own way. And I think, Benicia, when they decide has a significant impact, they'll probably have a different standard than Stockton or, other communities. So I think this will work itself out over time.
Maybe it might be helpful if the courts have defined this in some fashion or measured the meaning of substantial impact and turned the significant impact, maybe we could find some language. We'd not put it in the regulation, but it would be helpful to have some comfort, I think, to all of us. I suspect the courts have dealt with this several times, not often. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, it's been dealt with a lot in the CEQA context, but the unique thing about this definition is that it's applied to the co-equal goals. So even though we're borrowing this idea from the CEQA body of law, it's applied in a new context here because it's not CEQA. So we're using terminology that was developed for CEQA because similar terminology is being used in the Delta Reform Act.
But still would be helpful, in my view, to have some analogies to look to. I'm not talking about incorporating anything, but if we knew that language from courts, that if the Supreme Court of California has made some comments with respect to this, it'd be helpful. That's all I'm saying.
Well, it might be worth, I have this faint recollection you guys submitted as part of a larger memo to us, a year and a half ago, some references to some of the cases. Chris, refresh my memory.
Well, we'll take a look at the issue, and I think that, I can't even recall, though, whether or not we got any comments directly on the point, since we've debated this for about 2.5 years in this go-round on the term substantial compared to significant. I think our intention has always been that we would have some kind of user's guide playbook to how all this works to give the regulated community some assurance that they can fill out their forms correctly and that this can all be done in an efficient manner. Again, what we don't want to do is add guidance or other documents out there that are somehow going to affect how we're going to interpret this regulation. or
Causing a
change the regulation.
recirculation of the Delta Plan,
Well,
the
that-
environmental impact report,
Well, it's
and all of
it's
their
not that.
documents?
It's basically, there's something called underground regulations. And what you want to do when you have a regulatory package is put it all in the regulations. So you don't want all these guidance documents and appendices and checklists and other things. They're fine so long as they mirror the regulations, but to the extent that they change interpretations, that we don't want to do. So I think that in this go-round, we want to make sure that we address all of the comments that were submitted on these regulations first and foremost. And then in any event, I think in the end game, we were intending to put out some kind of playbook or guide to how all this works.
The most interesting thing about this discussion is that what generated this language primarily was that the question was raised, what about projects, do they have a cumulative impact or not? So somebody comes in and says, well, I'm only doing 2 houses this year, and then 4 houses the next year, and then 10 houses the third year. This language, and then of course cumulative impact, everyone goes nuts about cumulative impact because it may limit the activity. And so this language was largely constructed to deal with that as an issue in a way that tried to protect the basic framework. That's dropped off, and it's now the theoretical discussion.
Well, I'm glad you raised.
That's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. A finer point on that. The definition itself, you'll notice, is more compact than the language that we had before. It's listed in strikeout on the bottom of page 19. Yep. We had some comments about the use of some of our terms that weren't fully developed or defined, like baseline, that we had also borrowed from the CEQA context. We took that to heart, and we've made some changes to try to make this definition more concise. Mr. Chair, the idea of cumulative impact, though, we still have some commenters that are against that idea and notion.
Boy, am I sure aware of that.
The idea is still here, though. It's still embedded in the definition of significant impact. What we've done is we took a fresh look at how cumulative impact, again, in the CEQA context, is actually defined and used in practice, and we've made what I think are some real good improvements to our language. Although the term cumulative is taken out, the notion is still in here, but we've made some refinements that I think are actually more beneficial to the regulated community in terms of tightening up what we intend as reasonably foreseeable and closely related past, present, foreseeable future projects. That it's language that's from CEQA, developed case law on this, but in general, the definition itself is a lot more concise and more compact. So with that.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I just kind of looking at it simply, would substantial be in effect that's 50% more? I mean, that's a measurement. Is that something that could be considered?
I don't know what the answer to that is, and I don't know if a lot of this is very contextual, and it depends on what the project is. So I can pretty much guarantee that there's no formula that says 50%.
I mean, I think
so
50% more antique shops in Walnut Grove would have a pretty different kind of impact than 50% more water taken out of the Delta. So I think it would depend on the context in which it was occurring.
God, you keep thinking of these really interesting comparisons, Mr. Ray. Well, look, this is one of the interesting things. If you keep going back to what the statute told us to do, the statute defines state interests in the Delta with some clarity, and that's the surprising thing to me about this entire episode. Legislature traditionally lets every interest group define and add to a laundry list of items something that is equally of value. So the end result is the laundry list is there, but there's no state policy. But the state policy of the co-equal goals and the inherent objectives that help define them kind of I was going to use the word balancing, and I'll still use it. It's not quite right, but it's closer to what the statute advised us to do. And of course, each and every discrete interest area and group around the whole state would prefer that their interest be first before other, and the legislature tried to accommodate that by choosing water reliability for California and an improved, protected, restored delta ecosystem done in a way that reflects unique characteristics of the delta. It was a new course. I thought it was pretty surprising legislation, and it's going to take a while to answer all the detailed questions. But the approach, for all the complexity we've got, follows the statute, substantially follows the statute, and I think over time it's going to work itself out pretty well. Can't answer every question in advance, particularly when you don't have a specific casing or project or idea or notion in front of you, and this is only speculation.
Yeah, and I again, to put this in context, which we have to do, where we started, if you recall, what was it, 2.5 years ago, the discussion was that we were going to have hundreds of thousands of covered actions, that everything was going to be a covered action, that we were taking a regulatory approach that was overburdening and beyond our authority, and that it was the wrong approach. And I think that what you've done is you've come out now with a very balanced and measured plan that's true to the statute. And I think that, based on our estimates,
couple dozen covered actions.
Yeah, what we're talking about are, again, projects that have big impacts, beneficial, negative, but big projects for the most part. And there's likely going to be a handful as opposed to hundreds and thousands. So I think that we've come a long way in trying to define what we think is at least the foundational approach, and I think we're almost there.
Okay, well, let's get through council questions on this in the order we're talking about them, then get to public comment. Other questions on this section, the significant impact? Don?
Not significant. I did want to go back to page 16 to ask why those were taken out, though, under section that referenced my question, under 3.
Page 16,
Yeah,
the language in strikeout.
Yeah. It says put it back in the Delta plan, but I think you lose some emphasis by not having it here. So,
well, I think this definition of delta as a place, if you look at how the plan's composed, there are very precise definitions of water supply reliability and achieving the critical goal of restoring, enhancing the delta ecosystem. The definition that's in the delta plan of protecting the delta as a place, it brings forward the language that was used in the Delta Vision Task Force report about that's now to be retained here. And then we conceded that people had a lot of different views about the delta as a place, depending, we had a narrative in the delta plan that said depending on where you live and who you are, what the delta means as a place can be pretty different kind of things.
yeah.
And we had a listing of some of the essential values of the delta. We struggled with trying to include them in here. We tried to provide a more thorough definition. And we worried that would be too prescriptive, that it eliminated the flexibility that locals, agencies would have, or others would have, or the community would have in commenting on an action to describe really what they thought was inherent in the delta as a place. And so we backed off from that. And then I think somebody else who was drafting this said, we'll just refer to the strategies, but they were listed here, but these are just strategies. They don't define what the delta as a place is either. I mean, how does designating the delta as a special place, like the National Heritage Area, how does that define the delta as a place? It recognizes it's special, but it's not part of its definition. And so that was the reason we finally decided, you know what? The simpler definition that was derived from the Delta Vision Task Force was sufficient. It's one of the more ambiguous terms in the law, but I think that's because people struggled with it.
Well, right, but this at least went one step further than Delta Vision or the legislation, and it may not be perfect. I'm not sure what would be, but It does talk about those things and about, it's about agriculture, recreation, its communities. It's certainly recognizes its importance. It relates to state and regional infrastructure. Talks about, the economic vitality. So, I mean, it gets a lot of elements. Again, I don't mean that's not all inclusive. So, again, without being too prescriptive, I didn't think it was being prescriptive. I thought it would be more definitive, at least in giving some of those things you would want to as strategies to encourage. I think they're consistent with the economic sustainability plan, and I believe with stated goals and land resource management plan, certainly in the Delta plan, and reflecting, I think, of a lot of the elements, but not all inclusive. So I get what you said, but they were in, I guess I would argue that this may not be the entire list, but it certainly gives a little more background for, the first-time reader of the Delta plan. If you're looking at definitions beyond what's in the law or in the Delta vision, gives you an idea of some of those things that were thought about as we debated, and put this plan together.
No, it's certainly the council's choice. I think, we at the time we initially drafted the regulations thought this would be helpful. We received some criticism of it, and as we were going through and doing some clarification of the definition in response to comments, we ended up with here. We could check if you want to see who submitted comments about this, and we could understand it.
That's what I was going to go look at the comments on it then. So, okay, I'll do that before we get conclude here. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Mr. Fiorini? Okay. Now, other questions on the definitional stuff? Other questions? Okay. Mr. Fiorini, you had a point on the water transfer stuff, which is the last stuff in the definitional.
Yes. Dan, what regulation is that?
Yeah, it's on page 20. And this would be it would be the continuation of FF that begins on 19, but this would then be the list of categories of projects that we, by regulation, would determine do not have a significant effect. And you've got these three choices on page 23, which is the current regulation and the current drawn from the current regulatory policy in the plan, and then 3A, which is the staff's recommendation to extend the sunset by an additional year, and then 3B, which would just eliminate the sunset altogether and would determine that one-year transfers don't have a significant impact.
Right. So we have a choice to make of those three.
Well, sometime.
The
This is too long.
annual water transfers are an important part of maintaining a reliable supply for a lot of agencies. This regulation was put in place because we were led to believe that the annual transfers were excluded from the CEQA process, and therefore water agencies were gaming the system. I did some research. I went back to a PPIC publication entitled Water and the California Economy, and since the year 2000, water transfers have leveled off, and short-term water transfers, one-year transfers, have declined. That suggests to me that the allegation that the system is being gamed is incorrect. There is a need to streamline, overhaul, update, however you want to describe the approval process for these transfers, not only the annual transfers, but some of the longer term as well. And we have a recommendation in place to bring Department of Water Resources and others together to consult and confer and recommend the necessary or recommended changes. And the reason for putting the deadline in this regulation was to add the threat of making that annual transfer exclusion go away. Well, I think we need to do everything we can to ensure that we address, the appropriate agencies address updating water transfer regulations and so on. But I don't think that water agencies that are dependent upon these from time to time should be put in jeopardy. We're the second year of a drought. When this sunsets, we could be in the fourth year of a drought, and this could be a very, very valuable tool.
And I don't want this council to be placing agencies in a position that creates a hardship, an unnecessary hardship. So it would be my suggestion to ask staff to consider realistically, how long will it take for these agencies to come together, to meet, to confer, and to provide recommendations as we've asked for, and then set that deadline in conjunction with what you realistically think it's going to take to avoid this gap, this potential gap in the exclusion of the one-year transfers. Is December 31st, 2015 enough time? Can we coordinate and synthesize and bring these agencies and interests together and come up with a product by then? Do we need another year? Do we need 2 more years? I'm not opposed to a deadline. I just don't want to make it unrealistic and create a gap at potentially a time when we're in the 4th year of a drought.
Some context on this. You recall that I raised this issue, but in part raised this issue because the Department of Water Resources previously had, or maybe still does have, a task force to do just exactly this, and it's essentially been inactive for the last several years. The reason I suggested that we consider a deadline is because it is a gentle prod to people who've already said they want to do it. Gee, just get it done so we don't have to review this stuff. I think you're going to find a lot more really complicated questions that come up, and the testimony of the gentleman from San Joaquin County yesterday was kind of a flag to me. Oh yeah, well, we're going to claim that all the water we've reserved for future rights that we've never gotten are suddenly ours to market. I mean, that suggests to me that there are a lot of questions that are around, since the potential claims against the water supply exceed the available supply by a massive amount. Water Board said 3 times the highest recorded flow level in history are just the water rights and claims they know about. Forget the ones that are out there unclaimed. So I'm not wedded to a 2015 date, but the prod to the parties who've already said they want to do it to get the damn thing done is important to me.
Can we get testimony from
Yeah.
Department of Water Resources? No, specifically DWR, if they're the ones who have a task force.
They
that they're
made
working
comments, in my recollection, and didn't DWR comment, Dan, on this aspect in their one of or another of their comment letters?
They have previously commented on this. You'll recall that yesterday they testified that they were supportive of the staff's recommendation. So I think their preference is that we would extend the deadline by a year.
Well, I mean, Randy, I think correctly raises the question of how big a job is this to do. I'd like more than a endorsement, which is what they gave us. It's nice yesterday as to what they've been doing and what the difficulties are, or maybe a little more. It's interesting to know that short-term water transfers have gone down, but there's a lot of things I don't know. Others presumably do. Well, how many are there? Do they happen in wet years and dry years alike, or are there differences, or what's the pattern? And are there some who use it all the time, some who never use it? And it's possible that DWR hasn't reached a conclusion because of the complexity of that. And I'd like to have some sense of that rather than just saying, this is a deadline, get it done.
We can certainly have those conversations with them. In preparation for this hearing, we did go back and with our consultants tried to review records of water transfers that might have occurred. And the information that our consultants were able to pull together was incomplete, they suggested, recognizing that because some number of transfers are unregulated, they were having to look at information they'd gathered from private sources about water markets that they apparently were aware of. And so we had hoped we could pull that information together to provide some basis for this conversation. I don't think we'd be able to get better information within the next couple of months.
So, Randy, if we adopted the staff recommended deadline the end of 2015, and it proved for some reason to be unrealistic, nothing would prevent the council from revisiting it and extending it further, right?
That's correct. The provision allows for the potential of the council extending the deadline. I'm just bringing up the reality of what we may be facing 2 years from now, and the fact that according to the PPIC information, and it's largely a function of the inability to convey water through the delta that has led to reduced annual transfers. But I just want to go on record as saying that if we don't meet the deadline, let's not, as a council, create a gap in the ability to use this important tool. And I agree, Patrick, that we should have a very meaningful conversation with DWR and determine what is an achievable deadline for this process and use that as the guidance for what we include. But if we want to go with 2015 with understanding that we can reopen it later, that may be what we have to do.
Chair,
Ms. Gray?
just comment. My position has always been 1 year transfers be exempt. And in light of the information, I'm not sure, Randy, are you asking for the council to reconsider this at the next meeting, or after you have that discussion with DWR? Are you proposing just council adopting number 2 with the thought that we can reopen the discussion? What are you proposing this morning?
I don't think we will be able, as a group, to agree to exempt it entirely. I think that we're given the differences of opinion, that we're going to have a date. All I'm saying is that we authorize staff to consult with DWR, determine what is a realistic deadline, and then, as we've done with many of these other issues, allow them to update that number based on that conversation.
I know we're not acting on this right now. Just a comment, Mr. Stevens, Ms. Wolfsberg, just think about if Mr. Fiorini's suggestion were made, Ms. Gray's suggestion were made, how that would affect the process leading to the May adoption, Delta Plan, certification of EIR, and so on, and whether it would be sufficient to leave optional language. Okay, it's not sufficient to leave. Okay, well, you guys think about it as we get public testimony on all this section, please, because we're going to circle back to you on that. Okay. All right.